On the morning of November 15th, 1959, a quiet Sunday in western Kansas, something was terribly wrong at the Clutter farm. The hired hand noticed it first when he arrived for work. The house sat too still, the curtains still drawn against the prairie sun. No sounds of breakfast being prepared, no movement in the windows, just silence pressing against the white clapboard walls like a held breath. When he knocked on the door, nobody answered. When he called out, only his own voice echoed back across the empty fields. And when he finally walked inside, into the clean, orderly rooms of one of the most respected families in Finney County, he discovered a scene so brutal, so senseless, that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. 4 people were dead. The entire Clutter family, murdered in their own home while they slept. The news spread through the small town of Holcomb, Kansas, like wildfire through dry wheat. In a community where people never locked their doors, where neighbors trusted neighbors, and everyone knew everyone else's name. This wasn't just a crime. It was the end of innocence itself. Because if something this evil could happen to the Clutters, the most decent, hard-working, God-fearing family anyone knew, then it could happen to anyone. But to understand the horror of what happened that November night, you first need to understand who the Clutters were. You need to see the life they had built on the Kansas plains, brick by brick, season by season, with honest work and quiet faith. You need to know what was stolen from them before you can grasp the magnitude of the loss. Herbert Clutter was a man who embodied everything Americans believed in during the 1950s. He was 48 years old, tall and lean with the weathered face of someone who spent his days under the sun. He didn't inherit his farm. He built it himself through decades of careful planning and relentless effort. He transformed barren prairie land into one of the most prosperous wheat farms in Kansas, covering 800 acres of rich soil that produced crops so abundant they became the envy of neighboring counties. But Herb Clutter was more than just a successful farmer. He was a pillar of his community, the kind of man people turned to when they needed advice or help. He served on the local school board, worked with the Agriculture Extension Office, and mentored younger farmers who were just starting out. He was a devoted Methodist who lived his faith through action, not just words. He didn't drink alcohol, didn't smoke, and expected the same discipline from his family. His wife, Bonnie Clutter, was 45 years old, a gentle woman with kind eyes and a smile that put people at ease. Before her marriage, she had been Bonnie Fox, the daughter of a prosperous farmer from a neighboring county. Friends remembered her as vivacious and full of life in her younger years. But over time, something inside her had broken. She suffered from what doctors in those days vaguely called nervousness, a condition that sent her to hospitals and clinics seeking relief she could never quite find. Some days she could barely get out of bed. Other days she tried desperately to be the wife and mother she believed she should be, forcing herself through the motions of cooking and cleaning until exhaustion overtook her again. Despite her struggles, Bonnie loved her family deeply. She worried endlessly about her children, prayed for them constantly, and did everything she could to create a warm home, even when her own mind felt like a battlefield. Her condition wasn't her fault, but in the 1950s, mental illness carried a heavy weight of shame and misunderstanding. Herb stood by her through it all, loyal and patient, even as he shouldered more and more of the household responsibilities. The Clutter children were the pride of their parents' lives. Nancy, 16 years old, was everything a small-town Kansas girl was supposed to be. Pretty and popular, she was class president, a member of the 4-H club, an accomplished musician who played clarinet in the school band. She could bake a perfect cherry pie, sew her own clothes, and still find time to help her father with the farm bookkeeping. Boys from all over Finney County found excuses to stop by the Clutter farm, hoping to catch her attention. But Nancy was sensible and focused, already planning for college and a future that stretched far beyond the wheat fields of western Kansas. Her younger brother Kenyon, 15 years old, was quieter and more reserved. He was a thinker, the kind of boy who preferred spending time in the basement workshop, building things with his hands. He was skilled with tools, patient with complex projects, and deeply curious about how things worked. Teachers saw promise in him, the makings of an engineer or architect. His sister Nancy adored him, and despite the typical brother-sister squabbles, they were close. They understood each other in the way that siblings do, sharing silent jokes and unspoken support. The two older Clutter daughters, Eviana and Beverly, had already left home. They were in their 20s now, married and building their own families. They would return often to visit, bringing grandchildren for Herb and Bonnie to dote on. The farmhouse that had once been filled with the noise of 4 children still echoed with laughter when everyone gathered for Sunday dinners or holiday celebrations. It was a good life, built on solid values and honest work. The Clutter home itself reflected the family's character. It wasn't ostentatious or grand, but it was substantial and well-built. 2 stories of white-painted wood with green trim, it sat surrounded by elm trees that provided shade in the brutal Kansas summers. Inside, the rooms were neat and orderly. Bonnie insisted on cleanliness, even when she didn't have the strength to manage it herself. Nancy had taken over many of the household duties, keeping everything running smoothly with a maturity beyond her 16 years. The house had all the modern conveniences of the late 1950s: running water, indoor plumbing, electric lights, a telephone party line shared with neighbors. The kitchen was Bonnie's domain when she felt well enough to use it, with cream-colored cabinets and a new electric stove that was her pride. The living room held comfortable furniture arranged around a television set, though Herb limited how much the children could watch, preferring they spend their time reading or doing chores. Upstairs, the bedrooms were simple and practical. Nancy's room reflected her personality, tidy and cheerful with curtains she'd sewn herself. Kenyon had claimed the basement as his workshop and bedroom, preferring the cool quiet of the lower level where he could work on his projects without disturbing anyone. Herb and Bonnie's bedroom was on the main floor, positioned so Herb could hear if anything went wrong in the night, though nothing ever did. Not until that November evening. In 1959, Holcomb, Kansas was the kind of place where crime was almost non-existent. The biggest problems the local sheriff dealt with were traffic violations, the occasional drunk and disorderly, maybe some teenagers getting rowdy at a Friday night dance. Murder was something that happened in cities, in the dark alleys of Chicago or New York, not on peaceful farms where wheat grew tall and straight under endless blue skies. People didn't lock their doors because they didn't need to. Neighbors helped neighbors. Children played outside until the streetlights came on. Women hung laundry on clotheslines without fear. The worst thing most people could imagine was a bad harvest or an unexpected frost. The idea that someone might break into a home and harm a family, that evil might walk right through an unlocked door and destroy everything good and decent, was simply unthinkable. But on Saturday, November 14th, 1959, as the sun set over the Kansas prairie, 2 men were driving toward Holcomb with exactly that in mind. Their names were Richard Eugene Hickok and Perry Edward Smith, and they were about to shatter the peace of an entire community in ways that would echo for decades to come. Dick Hickok was 28 years old, a handsome man with dark hair and an easy smile that made people trust him, at least at first. He'd grown up in Kansas, not far from Holcomb, in a family that struggled but stayed together. His parents worked hard, tried to raise him right, attended church regularly, but somewhere along the way, Dick had developed a hunger for more than his circumstances could provide. He wanted nice cars, pretty girls, easy money. He wanted respect without having to earn it through years of patient labor like Herbert Clutter had done. Dick had been in and out of trouble with the law since his late teens. Bad checks, petty theft, nothing violent, but enough to land him in the Kansas State Penitentiary where he met Perry Smith. In prison, men shared stories, traded information, made plans for when they got out. And it was in those conversations behind bars that Dick first heard about the Clutter farm. A former cellmate, a man who'd briefly worked for Herb Clutter, had mentioned in passing that the farmer was wealthy, that he kept a safe in his office filled with cash. It was prison gossip, probably exaggerated, maybe even completely false. But Dick's mind latched onto it like a tick on a dog. He began to imagine the Clutter farm as his ticket to the easy life he'd always wanted. All he needed was someone to help him, someone willing to do whatever was necessary. Perry Smith was 31 years old and carried more darkness in his past than most people accumulate in a lifetime. He was short, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a powerful upper body built up through years of physical labor and weightlifting. His childhood had been a nightmare of abandonment and abuse. His parents had split when he was young. His mother drank herself to death. His father, a violent and unpredictable man, sometimes took Perry and his siblings on wild adventures through the West, but more often simply disappeared for long stretches. Perry had spent time in orphanages and detention centers where the treatment was harsh and sometimes cruel. He'd been injured in a motorcycle accident that left him with chronic pain and a distinctive walk. He'd traveled the country working odd jobs, serving in the merchant marine, always searching for something he could never quite name. He was intelligent, even artistic, with dreams of becoming a famous treasure hunter or musician. But his dreams always seemed to crash against the hard reality of his circumstances. He and Dick had bonded in prison, two misfits who understood what it meant to feel like the world had cheated them. When they were both released, they stayed in touch, meeting up to plan small crimes, always looking for that one big score that would change everything. When Dick told Perry about the Clutter farm, about the safe supposedly full of money, Perry was skeptical, but he also had nowhere else to go and no better options. So when Dick insisted they could pull it off clean, get in and out without anyone getting hurt, take the money and disappear to Mexico to start new lives, Perry agreed. On that Saturday afternoon, they stole a car and began the drive to Holcomb. They stopped along the way to buy supplies: rope, tape, a knife, gloves. Dick insisted they needed the items just in case, for control, to keep the family quiet while they found the safe. He kept reassuring Perry that nobody would get hurt. This was just a robbery. They'd tie everyone up, take the money, and be gone before dawn. Simple, clean, no violence necessary. But Perry had brought his own supplies: a shotgun, a hunting knife. Later, he would claim he didn't really believe there would be a safe, that he suspected from the beginning this was all going to go wrong. But he went anyway, driven by a mixture of loyalty to Dick, desperation for money, and something darker. A rage that had been building inside him since childhood, looking for a target. As night fell over the prairie, the two men drove down the lonely roads toward the Clutter farm. The November air was cold and clear. Stars scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on a dark table. They passed fields of harvested wheat, farmhouses with lights glowing warm in windows, families settling in for a quiet Saturday evening. Dick knew the way. He'd driven through Holcomb before, studying the layout, making sure he could find the place in the dark. The Clutter family had spent that Saturday like any other. Herb worked around the farm, checking on things, making notes about what needed to be done before winter truly set in. Nancy went to a 4-H meeting in the afternoon, then returned home to help prepare dinner. Kenyon worked in his basement workshop. Bonnie stayed in her room for much of the day, fighting one of her bad spells, but she came down for dinner and managed to eat a little. After dinner, Nancy called her boyfriend Bobby Rupp. They talked for a while about school, about plans for the upcoming week. Bobby asked if he could come over, and Nancy said yes. He arrived around 7:30, a nice boy from a good Catholic family, respectful and polite when he greeted Mr. and Mrs. Clutter. He and Nancy sat in the living room watching television for a while. Then Nancy walked him to the door around 11 o'clock. They said goodnight, and Bobby drove home, the last person outside the family to see any of the Clutters alive. Inside the farmhouse, the family prepared for bed. Herb did his usual evening routine, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. Nancy brushed her teeth, changed into her nightgown, set her hair in curlers for church the next morning. Kenyon went down to his basement bedroom, probably reading before sleep. Bonnie took her medication, the pills that sometimes helped her rest, and settled into bed beside Herb. The house grew quiet. The only sounds were the usual creaks and sighs of a wood frame building settling in the night chill, the distant whisper of wind across the prairie, maybe the bark of a farm dog somewhere in the darkness. Peace wrapped around the sleeping family like a blanket. Then, sometime after midnight, two strangers walked through the unlocked door. What happened next would be pieced together later from evidence, from the killer's own confessions, from the terrible tableau the police found the following morning. Dick and Perry entered through an unlocked side door, moving quietly through the dark house. They had flashlights and made their way to Herb Clutter's bedroom first. Perry later said Dick took the lead initially, waking Herb by shining the light in his face and demanding to know where the safe was. Herb Clutter, confused and terrified, tried to explain there was no safe. He kept his farm records at the office in town. He had maybe $30 or $40 in his wallet, that was all. Dick didn't believe him, became angry. They tied Herb's hands, then went to check the rest of the house. They found Bonnie in another bedroom, Nancy upstairs, Kenyon in the basement. One by one, they were bound with rope and tape, gathered up like animals being prepared for slaughter. The search for the non-existent safe continued. Dick and Perry went through drawers, closets, checking everywhere they thought money might be hidden. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. The fortune they'd imagined, the safe stuffed with cash, had never existed. It had all been prison talk, exaggerated rumors, wishful thinking transformed into a deadly fantasy. As the hours passed and no money appeared, the situation grew more desperate and dangerous. The Clutters, bound and terrified, must have prayed silently for dawn, for their lives, for some miracle to save them. But no miracle came. Instead, somewhere in the dark, early morning hours, a decision was made, or perhaps not a decision at all, but a descent into chaos and violence that neither man could later fully explain. Perry Smith, the shorter man with the childhood full of pain, became the killer. He took his shotgun and his knife. He went to each family member, one by one. Herb Clutter was found in the basement furnace room, his throat cut and a shotgun blast to the head at close range. Kenyon was discovered nearby, also shot in the face. Upstairs, Nancy was in her bedroom, still in her nightgown with curlers in her hair, shot once in the back of the head. Bonnie was in her room, shot the same way. 4 lives ended in minutes. 4 people who had never harmed anyone, who had worked hard and treated others with kindness, who had simply been asleep in their own home on a Saturday night. Gone. Erased by 2 strangers searching for money that didn't exist. Dick and Perry fled into the night, taking Herb's wallet with its meager bills, Nancy's small transistor radio, maybe a few other items of negligible value. The total haul from their robbery was less than $50. For that, and for whatever demons drove them beyond mere theft, they had destroyed an entire family. As the sun rose on Sunday morning, the Clutter farmhouse sat quiet and still. Inside, the bodies lay where they had fallen. The blood had dried dark on the floors and walls. The rope that had bound them remained tight around lifeless wrists. Everything else looked almost normal. No signs of struggle or chaos. The killers had even covered some of the victims' faces, a strange gesture of either shame or twisted mercy that made the crime somehow even more disturbing. When the hired hand discovered the bodies and called the sheriff, the news hit Holcomb like a physical blow. People gathered in small groups on street corners, in church parking lots, outside the sheriff's office, trying to make sense of the senseless. Women cried openly. Men stood silent, their faces tight with shock and rising fear. Children sensed the adults' terror and grew quiet and watchful. The question everyone asked was why? Why the Clutters? Why this family that had harmed no one, helped so many, lived according to every rule society held sacred? Was it random? Was there some hidden motive, some dark secret that would explain this violence? The alternative, that evil could simply walk through an unlocked door for no reason at all, was too terrifying to accept. Sheriff's deputies and Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents swarmed over the crime scene. They photographed everything, measured blood spatters, collected evidence, interviewed neighbors. But they found few clues. No fingerprints of value, no witnesses, no obvious suspects. The killers had come like ghosts and vanished the same way. The investigation quickly focused on people who knew the family. Bobby Rupp, Nancy's boyfriend, was questioned extensively because he'd been the last to see them alive. But he had an alibi. He'd gone straight home after leaving the Clutters, and his devastation at Nancy's death was obviously genuine. Former employees were checked. Business associates were interviewed. Everyone who'd had any contact with the Clutters in recent weeks was scrutinized, but nothing pointed anywhere. Meanwhile, terror gripped the community. For the first time in living memory, people in Holcomb began locking their doors at night. Hardware stores sold out of locks and deadbolts. Families slept with weapons nearby. The trust that had been the foundation of small-town life had been shattered as completely as the Clutters' skulls. The funerals were held on Wednesday, November 18th, 1959. More than 1,000 people attended, filling the First Methodist Church beyond capacity, spilling out onto the lawn. The 4 caskets sat in a row at the front of the sanctuary. Herb and Bonnie, Nancy and Kenyon, a family united in death as they had been in life. The minister spoke of faith and senseless tragedy, of a community's loss and God's mysterious ways. People wept openly. Strong men who'd worked alongside Herb Clutter for years stood with tears streaming down weathered faces. After the service, the caskets were loaded into hearses for the drive to the cemetery. The procession stretched for more than a mile, cars moving slowly through the flat Kansas landscape under gray November skies. At the gravesite, as the minister read the committal service, a cold wind whipped across the prairie, bending the dried grass and making people pull their coats tighter. The caskets were lowered into the earth, returned to the same soil Herb Clutter had worked all his life. Then it was over. The mourners dispersed, heading back to homes that no longer felt quite as safe. But even as Holcomb buried its dead, the killers were hundreds of miles away, running from what they'd done. Dick and Perry had fled Kansas immediately after the murders, heading south and then west. They passed bad checks, stole gas, moved constantly to avoid being caught. They made it to Mexico for a brief time, but money ran out quickly. They returned to the United States, drifting through Nevada and California, always looking over their shoulders, always one step ahead of capture. For weeks, the case seemed to be going nowhere. The late investigator, Alvin Dewey of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, worked 18-hour days following every possible lead, but they all dead-ended. Then, more than a month after the murders, came the break they needed. A prisoner in the Kansas State Penitentiary, hoping to reduce his own sentence, told authorities about Dick Hickok's prison conversations regarding the Clutter farm. He remembered Dick talking about a score, about a farmer with a safe full of money. Suddenly, the investigation had names and direction. Agents learned that Dick Hickok and Perry Smith had been released from prison shortly before the murders. They discovered Dick had connections to the Holcomb area. They traced the men's movements and found they'd disappeared right after November 15th. The pieces began falling into place with terrible clarity. An all-points bulletin went out. Dick and Perry's photographs appeared in police stations across the country. Tips started coming in from people who'd seen the two men, though by the time police arrived, they were always gone. The net was tightening, but the fugitives remained elusive. Then, on December 30th, 1959, 6 weeks after the murders, Las Vegas police stopped a stolen car. Inside were Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. The men had been caught for a simple parole violation, not even knowing that every law enforcement agency in the Southwest was searching for them. It was the kind of small mistake that brings down even the most careful criminals. When questioned about the Clutter murders, both men initially denied everything. But physical evidence was mounting. Boot prints from the crime scene matched Perry's boots. Items stolen from the Clutter home were found in their possession. Witnesses placed them near Holcomb on the night of the murders. Most damning of all, their stories began to contradict each other as detectives pressed harder. Finally, first Dick and then Perry began to talk. Not out of remorse or conscience, but because each wanted to minimize his own role while implicating the other. Dick claimed Perry had done all the killing, that he'd tried to stop it, but Perry had gone crazy. Perry countered that Dick had been the mastermind, that the whole thing had been Dick's idea from the beginning. The truth, as it emerged through days of interrogation, was that both men bore responsibility. Dick had planned the robbery. Perry had pulled the triggers and wielded the knife. Together, they had murdered 4 innocent people for pocket change and a transistor radio. Their confessions filled in the terrible details that evidence alone could not reveal. The fear in the Clutter's eyes as they were bound. The desperate pleas for mercy that went unheeded. The cold calculation with which Perry had executed each family member, moving from room to room like a professional exterminator clearing a house of vermin. Reading the confessions, investigators felt physically ill. These weren't men driven by passion or defending themselves. They were predators who had killed methodically and without real reason. The trial began in March 1960 in Garden City, Kansas, just a few miles from Holcomb. The courthouse was packed with spectators, many of them friends and neighbors of the Clutters who wanted to see justice done. Security was heavy because emotions ran high. More than once, people had to be removed from the courtroom for shouting at the defendants, or breaking down in tears during testimony. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Physical evidence, witness statements, and the killer's own confessions left no doubt about guilt. The defense attorneys, court-appointed and doing their best with an impossible situation, tried to argue that Perry Smith was mentally ill, that his traumatic childhood had damaged him beyond repair, that he couldn't truly be held responsible for his actions. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about Perry's disturbed mental state, his violent fantasies, his inability to control his impulses. But in 1960 Kansas, such arguments carried little weight. The jury saw two men who had murdered an entire family in cold blood for almost no reason at all. Whether Perry Smith had psychological problems seemed irrelevant compared to what he'd done to Nancy Clutter as she lay bound and helpless in her own bedroom. After deliberating for only 40 minutes, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. The sentencing phase was equally swift. Kansas law allowed for the death penalty in cases of premeditated murder during the commission of another felony. The prosecution argued that nothing could be more premeditated than driving hundreds of miles to rob a specific family, bringing weapons and restraints, entering their home in the middle of the night, and systematically executing them one by one. The jury agreed. Both Dick Hickok and Perry Smith were sentenced to death by hanging. But in America, even condemned killers have rights. Appeals began immediately. Defense attorneys argued that the men hadn't received fair trials because of pretrial publicity in a small community where everyone knew the victims. They argued that Perry's mental state should have precluded the death penalty. They filed motion after motion, appeal after appeal, working their way up through state courts and eventually to the federal system. Years passed. Dick and Perry sat in cells on death row at the Kansas State Penitentiary, waiting. They wrote letters, gave interviews, maintained their appeals. Dick remained bitter and defiant, convinced to the end that he'd been railroaded by a system that wanted someone to pay, regardless of true guilt. Perry was more reflective, sometimes seeming to acknowledge the enormity of what he'd done, other times retreating into fantasy and self-justification. Meanwhile, in Holcomb, life struggled to return to normal, but never quite succeeded. The Clutter farm was eventually sold, the house demolished. Too many ghosts walked those rooms for anyone to want to live there. Nancy's friends graduated from high school, went to college, got married, had children of their own. But they never forgot the girl with the bright smile who'd been taken from them so suddenly. Bobby Rupp, Nancy's boyfriend, carried the grief with him for the rest of his life, always wondering if somehow he could have prevented it by staying later that night or insisting she lock the door behind him. The older Clutter daughters, Eviana and Beverly, had lost their entire immediate family in one terrible night. They had to continue living, raising their own children, but the shadow of that loss never lifted. Family gatherings felt hollow without Herb's steady presence, Bonnie's gentle voice, Nancy's laughter, Kenyon's quiet thoughtfulness. In 1965, a young writer named Truman Capote published a book called In Cold Blood, a detailed account of the murders based on years of research and interviews with everyone involved, including extensive conversations with Perry Smith. The book became a sensation, pioneering a new genre of true crime literature that read like a novel. Capote's elegant prose brought the story to millions of readers, ensuring that the Clutter murders would never be forgotten. But the book also brought fresh pain to Holcomb. Suddenly, their tragedy was entertainment for the whole country. Strangers drove through town taking photographs, trying to find where the Clutter farm had been. People who'd never known Herb or Bonnie or Nancy or Kenyon felt entitled to opinions about their deaths, about what it all meant, about whether the killers deserved sympathy because of their difficult childhoods. The legal appeals finally exhausted themselves. Every court that reviewed the case upheld the convictions and sentences. There were no reversible errors, no constitutional violations that warranted overturning the verdicts. The executions were scheduled, postponed, rescheduled, postponed again as last-minute appeals were filed and denied. It became a grim waiting game. Finally, just after midnight on April 14, 1965, more than 5 years after the murders, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith were led to the gallows at the Kansas State Penitentiary. A small group of official witnesses gathered to observe. Outside the prison walls, both opponents and supporters of the death penalty held vigil, some praying for the condemned men's souls, others celebrating that justice was finally being served. Dick went first. He walked calmly to the scaffold, made a brief statement apologizing to the Clutters' survivors, then waited as the noose was placed around his neck and the hood over his face. The trap door dropped. His neck broke instantly. Death was quick. Perry followed minutes later. He too made a brief statement, expressing regret, but offering no real explanation for why he'd killed 4 people who'd never harmed him. Then he too dropped through the trap, and it was over. Their executions didn't bring the Clutters back. They didn't erase the trauma from Holcomb. They didn't answer the question that still haunted everyone who'd known the family. Why? Why had this happened to them? What cosmic injustice had allowed 2 drifters to destroy something so good and decent? There were no satisfying answers, just the cold reality that evil sometimes strikes without reason, without warning, without mercy. In the years that followed, Holcomb slowly rebuilt its sense of security, though it would never be quite the same. The next generation grew up knowing the story, learning to lock their doors not from their parents' example but from their parents' fear. The town became known not for its prosperous farms or tight-knit community, but for the murders that had happened there one November night. The old-timers, the ones who'd known the Clutters personally, grew fewer as decades passed. They took their memories with them. The reality of who Herb and Bonnie and Nancy and Kenyon had truly been as living, breathing people, not just victims in a famous crime story. With each death, the Clutters became a little less real and a little more legend. The house where it happened was gone, plowed under and forgotten. The land returned to wheat fields. But the story persisted. Every few years, a new book or documentary would appear, examining the case from some new angle. Criminologists studied it as an example of spree killing. Sociologists analyzed it as a symbol of America's loss of innocence. Psychologists debated Perry Smith's mental state and whether it should have saved him from execution. But for those who'd actually lived through it, who'd attended the funerals and watched 4 caskets lowered into the ground, the Clutter murders would never be an interesting case study or a compelling narrative. It would always be a raw wound, a reminder of how fragile safety is, how quickly everything can be taken away. The Clutter family farm is gone now, but you can still visit Holcomb if you want. It's grown some since 1959, more houses, a few more businesses, but it's still recognizably a small Kansas farming town where wheat grows and the horizon stretches forever. If you ask the older residents about the Clutters, some will talk, sharing memories of Herb's integrity or Nancy's kindness. Others will change the subject, uncomfortable with how their town's identity became forever linked to that terrible night. There's a small cemetery on the edge of town where 4 headstones stand in a row. Herbert W. Clutter, 1904 to 1959. Bonnie Mae Clutter, 1914 to 1959. Nancy Mae Clutter, 1943 to 1959. Kenyon Neal Clutter, 1944 to 1959. Sometimes visitors leave flowers there, people who never knew them but were moved by their story. The graves are well tended, the grass around them kept neat. In the end, what can be said about the Clutter murders that hasn't been said 1,000 times already? That they represented the end of a certain kind of American innocence? That they demonstrated how thin the line is between safety and catastrophe? That they proved evil can appear without warning in the most unlikely places? All of that is true, but it misses something essential. Before they were victims, before they became characters in a famous book or subjects of documentaries, they were people. Real people who woke up each morning and worked hard and loved their family and tried to do right by their neighbors and their God. Herb Clutter walked his fields and worried about the weather and made plans for the future. Bonnie struggled with her fears and tried to be strong for her children. Nancy laughed with her friends and practiced her clarinet and looked forward to college. Kenyon built things in his workshop and daydreamed about what he'd become when he grew up. They had hopes and fears and silly jokes and private moments. They were alive, fully and completely alive, until two strangers decided to take that life away. That's the real tragedy. Not the forensic details or the legal proceedings or the cultural impact. The tragedy is the simple, terrible fact that four good people went to bed on a Saturday night and never woke up, killed for no reason by men they'd never met, in a home where they should have been safest. Their murders sent ripples through time that continue even now, more than 6 decades later. They changed how Americans think about safety in their own homes. They influenced criminal justice policy and death penalty debates. They inspired art and literature and academic study. But perhaps most importantly, they serve as a reminder that beneath all our civilization, all our laws and social contracts and assumptions about how the world works, chaos lurks. The thin membrane separating order from violence can tear at any moment. The Clutters believed in hard work, faith, and community. They played by the rules and expected the world to play by them too. That November night taught a terrible lesson about how wrong such expectations can be, about how the universe doesn't protect the good or punish the wicked according to any pattern we can discern. Sometimes evil just is, appearing without purpose or meaning, leaving only devastation in its wake. What happened to the Clutter family could have happened to anyone. That's what made it so terrifying to their neighbors and continues to make it disturbing today. There was no hidden vice that brought judgment upon them, no secret sin that explains their fate. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when two damaged men came looking for something that didn't exist. The story of the Clutter murders is ultimately about the fragility of everything we take for granted. The safety of our homes, the continuation of tomorrow, the basic assumption that good people will be rewarded, or at least left in peace. On November 15th, 1959, in a small Kansas farmhouse, those assumptions died along with 4 innocent people. The sun still rises over the Kansas prairie. The wheat still grows in neat rows, golden and swaying in the wind. Life continues in Holcomb and in countless small towns like it across America. People still fall asleep at night trusting that they'll wake up in the morning. Because what choice do we have? We cannot live in constant fear, cannot treat every stranger as a potential murderer, cannot lock ourselves away from the world. We have to trust, have to believe that most people are decent, that random violence is rare, that our homes are sanctuaries. But somewhere in the back of our minds, in the quiet moments before sleep, we remember the Clutters. We remember that 4 people went to bed one Saturday night in a peaceful farming community and never saw another sunrise. We remember that evil can come through unlocked doors, and we wonder, just for a moment, whether we should check the locks one more time, whether we're as safe as we'd like to believe, whether tomorrow is really guaranteed. That's the legacy of what happened in Holcomb, Kansas, on that November night in 1959. Not just the deaths of 4 good people, though that alone would be tragedy enough, but the death of a certain kind of innocence, the shattering of assumptions we once held sacred about safety and justice and the basic goodness of the world. The Clutter family deserved better than the death they received. They deserved to grow old, to see Nancy graduate college and Kenyon become an engineer, to watch grandchildren play in the farmhouse yard, to look back on long lives well lived. Instead, they got terror and pain and darkness, cut down for pocket change by strangers who didn't even know their names. We tell their story not to glorify violence or satisfy morbid curiosity, but to remember them as they were, to honor the lives they lived, not just the deaths they suffered, to ensure that Herb and Bonnie and Nancy and Kenyon Clutter are more than just victims in a famous murder case, but real people who mattered, who were loved, who left a hole in the world when they were taken from it. And perhaps, in remembering them, we also remember to appreciate what we have while we have it. To cherish the ordinary moments that seem so permanent, but can vanish in an instant. To hold our loved ones a little closer. To say the important things before it's too late. To recognize that every peaceful night is a gift we should never take for granted. Because that's what the Clutters had, and what was stolen from them. Not just their possessions or even their lives, but their tomorrows. All the mornings that should have been theirs. All the conversations and laughter and ordinary joys that make up a life. Gone in a few terrible minutes, leaving only silence where there should have been sound, absence where there should have been presence, ending where there should have been continuation. The wheat still grows in Kansas. The wind still whispers across the prairie. But 4 graves stand as eternal witnesses to what was lost on that November night in 1959, when evil walked through an unlocked door and changed everything forever.